this over to Carrie Pomeroy from the University of California at Santa Cruz to moderate this session on social and economic dimensions of managing entanglements. Carrie, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Dan, and good morning, everyone. Give us just a second, please, here. I believe that I'll start my video. That would help. And I believe that, here we go. Tess is sharing our screen and PowerPoint. And let's see. Okay, great. So if we could go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. I went ahead and created a little bit of a marker here as well. And here we go. So I wanted to start out this morning just to frame our conversation over the next hour and change, and just planting the idea here that fisheries we can think about fisheries as complex social ecological systems. And there are a lot of interdependencies and interactions occurring at multiple scales. And you can define your scope very narrowly in terms of whales interacting with fishing operations, let's say, or you can broaden it out to understand what's going on in the larger ecological system, which we've seen over the past few sessions. You can also do the same thing with the social or human system, with the understanding that there are all these interdependencies and interactions that influence the immediate interaction that you might see on the water, and how that plays out over the long term. Next slide, please. Great. And so what we're going to do today, briefly, is explore some of the ways that social and economic information can be used and improved, potentially, to inform management decisions. And management decisions both in terms of formal management, but maybe also decisions in terms of how people can think about adapting to variability and change in the marine environment and in the particular context of whale entanglements, let's say. And so here are some guiding questions. Thank you. What do we mean by social and economic dimensions of managing entanglements? And then how are they relevant to management? And what social and economic information is available and what's needed to inform management decisions? When we think about the social, we're thinking about individuals, businesses, groups of people with a common interest, place-based communities, and the larger society. We can think about different features of those players: dependence on fishing for livelihood, well-being, satisfaction, meeting nutritional needs, and so on. We can think about safety, public involvement, equity, cultural values, and a number of other features, some of which we'll get into a little bit today. How are they relevant to management? People affect and are affected by management. Fishery participants on out through the seafood supply system and coastal communities and so on have needs and priorities. And in carrying out fishing activities and related activities, they're seeking to meet those needs and priorities. And management in turn affects whether and how those needs and priorities are realized. Folks respond or behave in particular ways, act in particular ways, and this in turn affects the ecological as well as the larger social system. So there are lots of questions to be asked, and hopefully, this session will highlight some of those. You'll also see that there is considerable information that may be available to address some of these questions going forward, but there are also gaps in information and understanding, and there are lots of different ways to build that information and help answer some of those questions. And we can think about how this all might relate to management strategy evaluation, where you're evaluating potential outcomes of alternative management actions on ecosystem components, including the human system as well as the ecological system, and identify some of those trade-offs. Next slide, please. So without further ado, you have a quick glance of our speakers this morning and our panelists. I'm going to turn it over here to Shannon Davis of the research group. He will present on behalf of himself and Gil Sylvia for about 10 minutes, and then we'll segue over to Rachel's presentation. Rachel's with the Southwest Fisheries Science Center. She'll present for about 5 minutes, and I'll come back with a little bit of further follow-up for about 5 minutes before we jump into the panel discussion. So thank you, and hopefully Shannon can join us.
And I think we've got Shannon on.
And Shannon, I think you may be muted on your phone.
And so that's either the main mute button that you would use like when talking, or try *6. Oh, you're unmuted. Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what the problem with computers worked before. Jumping into it, I'll talk about the 4 tasks that we did to evaluate ODF&W's proposed measures for reducing the risk of entanglement. They come under 2 categories there: early season closure and decreased effort. You'll see under decreased effort, we looked at 3 options: 10%, 20%, and 30%. The analysis was done using a bioeconomic model. I heard at the beginning of this webinar, all 3 states managers saying they wanted more socioeconomic information in order to evaluate what may be done in the future to reduce the risk. And here we had a model developed for another purpose that lends itself to evaluating proposed measures. The model was sponsored by an industry group in Oregon, a commodity commission that sets aside a certain tax on themselves for applied research. When we developed the model, I need to give a shout out to a couple of other participants in the model development, Noel Yoakum and Chris Cusack. At the time were PhD students and now are doctors. Noel works for Alaska Fisheries Science Center and Chris works for EDF. Gil Sylvia led the charge. I was the modeler, econometrician, and been assigned to explain the impacts for looking at these 2 proposed management measures. Next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? The model was developed over with a base period over 7 years, ending with the 2013-14 season. So the first thing that we wanted to do is make sure that the structure of it was still valid for evaluating the measures in a more current base period. So we did a little bit of work looking at 5 years since the base period that was used to develop the model. Here you see a graph of catch and price. As it turns out, and I'll mention a few things here in a minute, the structure of the fishery historically has been the same. We didn't expect it to look very much different in this current period, and indeed it did not. There were some seasons that had delayed start that were not as prevalent in their earlier model base period. Delayed start due to toxin levels, or in one case, a strike. Next slide. Looked at, other than price and catch, looked at some details in terms of pot pulls, catch per unit effort, and soak days. And you could see the trend over not only the base period there, but the more current 5 years. CPU looks like it's gone up a bit in the base period, but on the average, if you compare the current period with the base period, it does turn out to be about the same. The big indicator here is the way we see it for the task at hand, and that is to evaluate risk of entanglements. Bottom indicator there for soak days. So that's the number of days one pot spends in the ocean. Next slide, please. The trend of the base period over the in the current period over a season is shown by these two lines. And one statistical way to make the correspondence to test the validity is to look at analysis of variance. And it turned out that the correlation coefficients between these two indicators was very much positive. In one indicator for catch, I think it was 0.93, and the other one for soak days was 0.47. So we were confident, given this analysis, that the model as currently calibrated would reflect results for a more recent period from which it was developed. There has been one difference that was easy to deal with because the model as a product was developed to be interactive. You could change model assumptions through a dashboard and see what that did to results. Price was an exogenous variable. The price in the current period in inflation adjusted prices has been about 20% greater in the current period versus the base period. So all the results I'm presenting do reflect that price increase. Next slide, please. Heterogeneity. Jill and I kind of have been fighting this battle with our students, and what we see in literature is that the fleet is very diverse. And when we talk about impacts, it can have very much different impacts on one set of participants versus another. So for the model development, just looking at the data gives you some sense of categories, but we did use statistical procedures like discriminant analysis to make sure we're indeed picking up on different categories of vessels. It shows, I'm showing 5 categories here and have kind of given them cutesy names. The rules or the objectives that you run through discriminant analysis are mentioned at the bottom. The one I'll be pointing out examples today, of course, are the summers, because that's the period that we're going to be focusing on to avoid those impacts because of the occurrence of the transiting along the Oregon coast. Next slide, please. A lot of numbers here, but just in general, let me point them out. Look at the table bracketed in the red, and In the columns here are the different categories of vessels, and in the bottom right, of course, is season revenue. You can see that some of those categories are not participating in the summer. They do participate a little bit in the spring. But what we're really talking about in terms of impacts are the vessels that start the season, carry throughout the season, and fish into the summer. And you can see those summer, late spring are pretty small numbers relative to the whole season, but of course are very important to participants. Next slide, please. There was aspects of model development that as academicians we certainly wanted to get into. One was the spatial aspects of the fishery. Here I'm showing one season in a scattergram spread across the months of the season. And you can see the majority to start the season, they fish deep and shallow. As the season ends, it's shallow. During the summer months, after April, during this season, about 15% of the catch was deeper than 30 fathoms. We would have liked to build that sensitivity in the model, but it wasn't part of the model development goals at the time. It's left and relegated as a list of enhancement in the future. Next slide, please. So what were the results of running the model to show the impacts of early season closure or effort reduction or the combination of the two? I'm pointing out a couple of numbers here, talked about in the narrative in our reports. So 20% if you close the season at week 26, there would be a net loss of $13,000. You close it at week 22, it's $157,000. If you just close the season at week 18, and those numbers correspond to the Julian calendar in note 1 down below, we're talking $2.5 million out of a $47 million season average. Next slide, please. Okay.
Hey, Shannon, forgive me for interrupting. Yeah. If you could probably wrap it up in the next minute or two, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Here's the benefit of the bioeconomic model. And it's pointed out by some vessels actually benefiting from reductions of summertime fishing. So the summers take a hit per vessel, $7,000 if the season's closed in week 26. But all of the other categories actually have positive benefits. And that's carrying over the biomass that isn't caught during the summer months to the next year. So that's one of the benefits, of course, of having a detailed model such as this. Next slide, please. It's the same thing with effort. 20% effort reduction does hurt $717 per vessel participating during the summer. Other vessels are positively impacted. Next slide, please. Next slide. This just graphically shows the numbers that I've been talking about. Next slide, please. Study takeaways. We had concerns about using what was proposed in the management measures and how that applied to what could be analyzed with a model. first 20% less allowed pots, we had to assume that meant 20% less effort. We did not have the data, and the data is not being collected to make that capacity utilization assumption. More data has to be collected, and I understand that there's work underway to get that information in order to understand better what reducing pot tier numbers might result in less effort. The other points 3 and 4 here have to do with what we're calling a recommendation for more work to be done on the decision support tool. I really appreciated hearing about Dan talking about the details of that in a little bit different manner. But it's our recommendation looking at the example of Northeast on reducing risk to right whales, on what should be done in procedures and processes in order to have an evaluation tool that the states can depend on when they're developing their management plans and their take permit, so that we're staying away from any dysfunction that can result in waiting till management managers are proposed versus NIMS evaluating after they come in. All right.
All right. Hey, thank you very much, Shannon. And we'll have an opportunity, I'm sure, to come back to any particular follow-up questions when as we move in through the panel discussion. That was great, though. I'm going to turn it over now to Rachel, please. And Rachel, take it away. You have about 5 minutes, please. And I'll jump in if we're looking tight on time. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. So, hi, everyone. I'll start by introducing myself because I'm a fairly new face on the West Coast. I'm Rachel Seary. I am based at NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Centre, and I'm very excited to be joining this research effort to mitigate whale entanglement risk with the Dungeness crab fishery, and specifically to work on developing socio-ecological indicators for this issue. So many of you will know that one of the measures that's been taken to reduce this risk is temporary closures to the fishery. And my research will first ask what the economic impacts are of closing the fishery on the participants. Next slide, please. So as a preliminary estimate of these economic impacts, and I will stress that these are preliminary estimates, I've simply looked at comparing the revenue from closure years to the revenue in years where there were no closures. So the revenue change, or the direct loss to the fishery, is the actual revenue during closure years minus a baseline revenue from non-closure years. So just to explain where we got this baseline revenue from, the graphs on the left show revenue over time from the crab fishery from 1980. And you can see there that the trend in revenues changes drastically from about 2011. So from 2011 onwards, we've taken an average of revenue per year. We've taken out 2016 because there were harmful algal blooms which caused closures during that year. And the years we're comparing to are the two most recent fishing seasons. So the 2019 season, which is 2018 into 2019, and the 2020 season, which is 2019 into 2020. Next slide, please. There we go. So these are the results for the central management area of California. The graph shows revenue throughout the season. The black line shows our baseline revenue. The grey shadow around that line shows the confidence intervals around that average. The red line shows the 2019 season. The blue line shows the 2020 season. And the table at the bottom shows the change in revenue from the baseline. And it's important to stress here that there are a number of reasons, a number of interacting factors that can influence revenue during a certain year. So as well as the closures due to whale concentrations, there are late openers due to crab condition, due to harmful algal blooms, and this year even impacts due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So looking at this graph, starting with the red line, which shows the 2019 season, you can see that catches or revenues were lower than average throughout the season. So we can't attribute all of those losses just to closures due to whale entanglement risk. But we do have a closure starting mid-April in 2019 surrounding the lawsuit to do with whale entanglement. Then looking at 2020, you can see that there was a late opener for a month due to entanglement risk, and that meant that the fishery was closed during one of the most profitable months of the season. You can then see, though, in December, the fishery is able to recoup some of those losses. However, from about March onwards, the revenues become lower than usual. And that could be due to COVID-19 impacts. And I'd be really interested to have feedback about what those impacts were from the fishing community. Then at the end of the 2020 season, the fishery is closed again in May due to entanglement risk. But it's worth noting here that the fishery was planned to be closed on April 1st. And due to California ramp factors, using those 4 indicators, it was able to be shown that there was no substantial risk and the fishery was kept open until May. Next slide, please. So this is the same, but for the northern management area. You can see that for both 2019 and 2020, there was a late opener due to crab meat quality, not because of whale entanglement risk. In 2019, the Dungeness crab season was substantially shortened because of the lawsuit to do with whale entanglement. And in 2020, to my knowledge, there was no closure in the northern management area to do with whale entanglement risk. However, you do have much lower than usual revenue from about January onwards, which again could be due to COVID-19 impacts. Next slide, please.
If you could wrap it up shortly, Rachel, that would be great.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Thanks.
This is my last slide. So the caveat of this method that I've just shown you is that it's most useful to compare from year to year if catches and revenues are constant from year to year. And we know that in the Dungeness crab fishery, there's a lot of fluctuation between years. So going forward with my research, I'm going to take a slightly different approach. I'm going to use a statistical model to estimate the expected revenue during these closure years as if there had been no closures. And to deal with that fluctuation between years, the model will be fitted with estimates of crab abundance at the start of the season using Kate Richardson's depletion estimator model. It will be informed by historical data, but I will use vessel level data to get much more detailed information about the impacts to the individual as opposed to at a port level. It'll also use attributes such as the latitude of landings, the port that those landings are being landed at, the size of the vessel and the probability of those vessels fishing. And this will allow us to estimate the income and employment impacts of these closures to vessels from the Dungeness crab fishery, but also other West Coast fisheries. And what's going to be really important to this research is reaching out to the fishing community to tell us about the actual lived experience of these closures. So please do look out for survey requests in the coming months. And thank you for having me be part of this workshop.
Thanks very much, Rachel. That was great. And again, we will hold questions, and I'm going to take a few minutes to jump through my own presentation, and then we'll circle back with you all and the panel more broadly. All right. So Carrie Pomeroy here again. Next slide, please. And just as a quick refresher here, and thank you, Rachel, because we had you refer also to fisheries as social ecological systems, thinking about that complexity and some of what you spoke to, as well as what Shannon spoke to, addresses some of that complexity, variability, and change over time. Next slide, please. So in thinking about fisheries, social ecological systems, part of what we want to understand is who else is involved in the system, who plays a role, who influences what people do and is affected by what people do on the water as we circulate out through the shoreside support system, communities, consumers, and so on. Advance, please. And we're interested in California, at least in terms of our Marine Life Management Act and the recently amended master plan, in this idea of socioeconomic as well as ecological essential fishery information. And there's a whole suite of categories coming from a social science perspective that we're particularly interested in, and we bring information related to these topics together to answer diverse questions that relate to management, that relate to identifying community needs, and seeking to provide both managers and communities with information to help inform their decision making, sort of stepping back from their particular experience and being able to speak to some of the bigger picture issues or questions. And we're interested not only in what the impacts of a specific management action might be and how that might be addressed, but also thinking about the broader set of management objectives, some of which are compatible with one another, some of which are not, and how that all works together. But in fact, managers are seeking to address a variety of things like sustainable use, both ecological and human, well-being, whether it's material well-being or your relationships with folks or how you feel about fishing and how your family is doing and so on and so forth, minimizing adverse impacts on participants, communities, and local economies, fairness and equity, safety, avoiding or minimizing conflict, and being responsive to change are some of the things that are sort of embodied in both federal and state fishery management policy, coming from a California perspective, but also hearing some of this coming from Oregon and Washington as well. Next slide, please. So in thinking about managing entanglements and the social and questions that might be asked, and we're hearing some of these already, and I thought I would toss a few of these out, not to provide any answers or specific data analysis, but just to help illuminate some of that broader scope. We have questions related to how management options affect space use in a fishery, and not just in that specific fishery, for example, Dungeness crab or rock crab or whatever, but also in other fisheries that folks are involved in. And then the timing and location of shoreside infrastructure use and operations, relationships among fishermen, buyers, shoreside support providers, and many others in the larger system. And overall, the social and economic well-being of fishery participants and communities. Next slide, please. To build this information, we can use an iterative stepwise process. And it's something that's outlined in federal guidance for fishery management planning in terms of the social sciences. We have it outlined in terms of the work we did in developing some socioeconomic guidance to inform implementation of the MLMA in California. And it's really this process of seeing what information you have, working with that to help characterize the system, and then seeking to expand your understanding of the system over time through very targeted work that focuses on particular information needs as they become evident while consulting with a variety of players in the system. Next slide, please. And we can think about data streams, information, understanding, and application. And I think there's a really important point to make here, and I'm going to try to wrap this up in the next minute or so. But there's a lot of interest in data streams, but understanding what those data do and don't represent and how they can appropriately be used to understand phenomena, whether it's in the social system, the ecological system, or the relationship between the two. It's a complicated process, and it's really important to be mindful of those connections. And I think we've seen that demonstrated in a variety of ways in the talks over the past few days. There's quite a range in relevance of socioeconomic essential fishery information. I don't have time to speak to. There are both qualitative and quantitative approaches that are critically important to integrate in order to build that rich understanding of the way things actually work, interpret quantitative results, make sure we're looking at things the way, understanding what things actually do represent and what they may not represent. And of course, there's the importance of integrating diverse sources of information and doing a lot of ground truthing to the extent we can do that. And that's a collaborative effort. That doesn't just come from one set of players or another. We all need to put heads together to build this information. Next slide, please. And whoops, I think we have just wrapped up. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I was advancing my slides on my own computer and not paying enough attention to the one on the screen. What I'd like to do, though, is acknowledge collaborators on the MLMA Socioeconomic Guidance, Debbie Hazeltine-Nielsen, Ryan Bartling, and Nikki Georgilis, and Christy Uhas and the California Dungeness Crab Task Force for helping me understand better what's going on with the Dungeness crab fishery and this issue, among others. And now we'll turn to our speakers, or rather our list of panelists. Next slide, please.